Today is a good day because after a long cold winter it's finally spring and I can restart this project. Now I've managed to miss all the amazing weather that we've been having and we're in a bit of a dreek spell, but I'm not going to let that stop me. As a quick reminder, in the previous videos we dug the foundations, built the base frame, dug a soakaway, installed the insulation and fitted the subfloor. We then wrapped everything up for winter. It's now 6 months later and we're ready to start again. In anticipation of the work ahead, I asked my dad round for an extra pair of hands. Unfortunately, when we uncovered the floor, we found that water had somehow found its way in. I suspect this happened during Storm Elwyn, which means it's been this way for around 4 months. Although OSB 3 is rated for exterior use, full-on submersion for this long is asking a bit too much of it, and sure enough we'd found it swollen and delaminated in places. That meant our first job was to replace 2 of these floor sheets. Thankfully the frame itself seemed unharmed. In hindsight I wish we'd been a bit more thorough when fitting the damp-proof membrane that we'd used to overwinter the frame. I've never seen builders do this, but I know that bad weather is forecast for the rest of this build, and what with working mostly on my own and the time it takes to film everything, I'm concerned that the floor would get soaked and ruined once again. So I reinstalled the damp-proof membrane over the subfloor. This time with my dad's help, I did a better job of securing it. The plan is that once the structure is waterproofed, I can cut away the membrane.
While Michael and his dad work hard outside, I was busy in the workshop preparing timber for the walls. As you may or may not know, we intend to release build plans for this garden room. That means I got to work from some proper drawings which really sped things up. We'll release the plans and link them down below soon. But one thing to bear in mind with our plans is that some dimensions are very intentionally not provided. For instance, we haven't listed the dimensions of this end noggin. That's because what Michael draws up in the perfect CAD world is unlikely to reflect the real world of inconsistently milled timber. Instead, it's best to build your wall and then cut it to fit at the end. That's why we're holding off on releasing the plans for now. We want to thoroughly test them ourselves to make sure everything works as intended before sharing them with others. Getting to the cutting, I should first disclose that we were gifted these dust masks. Having said that, this isn't sponsored and we are under no obligation to say anything. Instead, we want to mention them because once in a while you come across a great product that really helps in the workshop. For quick and dusty tasks like this, it's perfect, and critically, it's much more likely to get used than the more cumbersome options. If you subscribe to our channel, you'll probably know how poor the extraction is on this miter saw, so a dust mask is essential. These ones by Basecamp go on so easy, and most importantly they seal to both my little face and Michael's much larger face without fogging up our goggles. The best bits of safety equipment are the ones that you use. Anything that's comfortable and easy to put on is a big win in our eyes. The fact that it also has solid filtration is amazing. I won't say any more, but coming from someone who has been through multiple masks in the past year, let me tell you this is a good one. If you follow our link down below, you can get a 10% discount and you'll be supporting the channel. After a few hours, I had all the timber cut to length and it was time to hand back over to Michael to start building. Maybe I shouldn't be so pleased, but it's always satisfying when you can prep all this timber and it's bang on.
I think what Dora is kindly saying there is that if I was doing the cutting, in my haste I would almost certainly have misread the tape measure at some point and cut some critical length too short. Needless to say, it's worth taking your time to do the job right, or better yet, hand it over to someone who will. When it comes to building the walls, here is some of the logic and jargon behind the design. On the rear wall we have a bottom plate and a double top plate. The double plate at the top helps to distribute the load of the roof when the joists don't line up with the studs. We then have noggins between the studs that help to stabilise the frame. At the ends we have California corners. These are just extra studs at 90 degrees that provide somewhere for the plasterboard to secure to later on. The sides are simple, with the only unique element being the furring strips at the top. These are simply timber cut to the angle of the roof. Doing it this way is the easiest way as the wall can be built square. The alternative way is to make the top plate angled, but that means a lot of angled cuts and I see no reason to complicate things. The front wall is where things get interesting as it needs to accommodate 2 windows and a large door. Above each of these there needs to be a header to redistribute the weight of the roof down to the floor via king studs and trimmers. Below the windows, there is a rough sill which is supported by bottom cripples and top cripples. The bottom plate will be kept full length across the doorway to ensure everything remains stable and dimensionally accurate until it is erected and secured. Then the red section can be cut away. I'll explain how to construct the headers later on, but the dimensions are governed by the distance that they need to span. As a rough rule of thumb, every inch of height is a foot of width, so a 4-inch header can span 4 feet, or a 6-inch header can span 6 feet. You can find header size calculators online if you're interested. We mentioned in the last video that we were going to cheat a little and be able to build a bigger building for essentially the same price. This all comes back to the 2.5 meter height limit that is allowed under the permitted development regulations that we discussed in part 1. But in our case, we're far enough away from the boundary that we're permitted to build a taller building. If we were limited to an overall height of 2.5 meters, then the walls would roughly be 2.1 meters. Since the timber comes in 2.4 meter lengths, we're effectively wasting 30 centimeters of every length. Whereas with this tweaked design, we have an average wall height of 2.3 meters, the result being that we can purchase the same timber but get a ceiling height that's around 20 centimeters higher. The only additional expense will be in the cladding. For anyone wondering, our build plans will accommodate both height options depending on your circumstances. We started with the back wall as this will be tricky to access later on. The studs will be spaced every 400mm, but the critical dimensions are every 1200mm since that's the dimensions of the OSB sheathing. With this in mind, we clamped the top and bottom plates together and marked out every 1200mm. We then began to lay out and build the wall. We did this on the building base since we know it's flat and found it much easier to build accurately while it's laying down rather than when it's upright. We assembled the frame with our first fixed nail gun and 90mm nails. There's no doubt that this route is considerably faster, it's strong, and it's fun to use. But as a woodworker, I did find the results rather rough at times. I had to remind myself that nobody will ever see this once it's assembled, and although it isn't the prettiest, it would take me hours longer without the gun. They aren't the cheapest, but if you're building, I would say purchasing a nail gun is a solid investment. We'll link this one down below. After fixing the critical studs in place, we then used the noggins as spacers to fix the remaining studs. Some of the studs were inevitably a little twisted, and I had to lever them straight using a clamp before nailing them in place. We then added the California corners, using screws this time to pull everything tight. We staggered the noggins to make it easier to add fixings, and then had to rotate the end noggins to fit with the California corners. Lastly, we added the top cap plate to the frame. This is secured with 2 fixings at every stud. The reason the fixings are at the studs is so that if a hole needs to be drilled for the wiring, we don't accidentally drill into a nail. There's much less chance of doing this if nails are kept to the studs. And then we attached the 11mm OSB sheathing. We debated if we should do this before or after raising the wall, but for our circumstances we decided to do it now. It is worth thinking carefully about the order that you build things, depending on the location, how many people you have working on it, and what the weather might be doing. What works for us here may not be the best for you. The sheathing adds a barrier against the weather, but it's also structural and adds a lot of strength to the wall. There are some shocking videos of houses collapsing because they're built too tall before adding the sheathing. Admittedly, not such a big issue with a garden room like this, but interesting nonetheless. Before attaching the sheathing, it's worth measuring across the diagonals to confirm the wall is square. Then start from the centre and work your way out, being sure to leave a 3mm expansion gap between the sheets. Add a fixing every 150mm on the edges and 200mm in the centre. Again, this is where a nail gun is a huge time saver. And of course, it's always worth getting a second opinion while you build. Is it strong?
No. No air.
Not strong enough.
Need more kilo. Need more.
Need more, okay. Oh dear, he didn't seem impressed. We quickly got onto building the sides. This time we decided not to add the sheathing until later. This meant they were light enough that we could move them aside until we were ready. To construct the headers, we used two 5 by 2 inch joists. This is conveniently the same timber as we used for the floor. The idea is that we sandwich them together to make a 5 by 4 inch piece. Glue isn't strictly necessary here, but again, coming from woodworking, I can't help but think it adds a lot of strength and stability. Unfortunately, the only timber I had available had a small twist in it, so I was careful to orientate each half so that the twists opposed each other, hopefully inclining them to become straighter rather than more twisted. I used plenty of exterior wood glue, then clamped it down to the bench while it dried. I then nailed it in a zigzag pattern every 150 millimeters. I was also careful to make the headers oversized so that once the glue dried I could cut them to the perfect length and leave the ends square. Since the design of the front wall leaves little space to fix the top cripples, I decided to fix them now using pocket hole fixings. The big moment, it's time to assemble the back and side walls. The question is, are we strong enough to lift the back wall? I'll leave you to enjoy the chaos. George, should we grab a level? Go grab a level, quick. Really, really, really fast. It's in the blue bin. Blue bin, left. Left. You turn right. I said blue bin. Honestly, that went so much smoother than I'd anticipated. Although the wall is heavy, Dora is surprisingly strong. The diagonal braces hold the wall securely while we align it and put fixings through the bottom plate and into the base frame. These fixings won't stop the wall tipping, but they do hold it in position. It was then an easy job to lift the sides into position and fix everything together. Yes, please. What have I done? We were careful to keep the bottom plate in line with the base frame, then we ensured the side wall was plumb and fixed it to the back wall with screws. We used screws rather than nails because they pull the frames together. The second wall was a little more complicated due to the cabling, but it's still straightforward with 2 people on the job.
Go up.
Up.
Keep going.
Keep going. Stop. Up. It was easiest for us to construct the front wall in the upright position. We started by securing the bottom plate to the base frame, which we'd carefully marked up with the location of all the studs. Then, due to the complexity of the front, we needed to think carefully about the best order to build it so we'd be able to get good fixing into everything. That meant we built the window sections first. To secure the headers, we put 4 nails through the king studs and into the headers. The general rule here is 2 fixings for every 2 inches of header. With that done, we raised them into place. We wanted to secure the bottom first, as that governs all our critical dimensions around the door. Since we obviously couldn't put a fixing into the end of the studs, we needed to toenail it into place. This is a method of driving nails in at an angle through the stud and into the bottom plate. We found the drawback of this method is the stud's tendency to move when the nail files in, so we placed a temporary block behind the stud to keep it in place while we nailed it. We were then able to put the top plate into place, check level and secure. We could then finish the door area and complete all the details. It's important to keep the dimensions accurate around the door and windows, particularly if you've already ordered them. Here is a slightly clearer view of the front wall now that it's assembled. Next on the agenda was adding furring strips. These can be bought off the shelf, but I decided to make them. I was hopeful of getting 2 from one length of timber, but unfortunately the dimensions didn't quite work out and I needed 4 lengths for 4 furring strips. The purpose of the furring strips is in part to support the roof, but realistically it's the front and rear walls that will do most of that work. Instead, with this build, their primary value is something for the sheathing to secure to on the outside and plasterboard on the inside. I made 4 furring strips, 2 for each side. Then I secured them to the sides with grab adhesive and screws, with a small gap in between. The grab adhesive is not really required, but I felt it would provide a better airtight seal. I then filled this gap with expanding foam. Timber is a poor insulator, so creating this foam-filled gap will improve the insulation within the building. For the sheathing, like all OSB, it needs a 3mm expansion gap between the sheets. A great tip here is to hammer a nail into the centre of the studs where 2 sheets join. The nail will be about 3mm thick, and it will make it easy to align the sheets while also maintaining the gap. I was concerned that sheathing was going to be difficult as I was on my own for this part, but I have to say it turned out to be easier than expected, and it proved to be a satisfying job as the frame starts to look more and more like a real building. I put a few scraps under the sheet to take the weight as I aligned it, then with a few nails and clamps holding it in place I could mark out the location of the studs. It was then a case of firing in 500,000 nails, or to be more accurate about 70 nails to secure the sheet permanently. To cut out the windows, I used a router with a flush trim bit. This did leave a nice finish, and I must admit it was fun, but I'm not sure it was the best approach. It used up a lot of batteries and made a huge mess. A vibratory multi-tool or reciprocating saw is probably the better approach, but whatever you can do to avoid using a handsaw. Whoops. And just like that, we've got something that resembles a building. Lastly, to complete the walls, I wrapped the building in a breather membrane. I wanted to do this early so I could fold it over the top of the walls for a nicer finish. We used Novia Reflex breather membrane, which we'll put a link to down below. It took us a lot of research to decide on this membrane. We liked it because it's high performance and a sensible price. Also, because it's reflective, it adds to the U value of the building. We also wanted to avoid the DuPont brand, which if you've watched Dark Waters on Netflix, you'll understand why. We wrapped the building from bottom up so that the overlap sheds any water. This will keep the building watertight. We used stainless steel staples to secure the membrane, and we did our best to keep it tight and even as we worked. Although Dora was on childcare duty that day, she strapped the baby to herself and gave me a much needed hand for the top. As recommended, we used double-sided tape between the layers. I'd like to go into more detail about the various membranes on this build, but I've decided that's a video in its own right. So I'll cover membranes and building design in the next video where I look at cold roof versus warm roof and then discuss which approach we'll be taking. I'll also point out a major flaw in many guardroom designs that bizarrely seems to be overwhelmingly overlooked even by the most methodical builders. Stay tuned for that one. I'll leave the membrane over the window cutouts until I'm ready to fit the windows, but I needed access inside to build the roof, so I cut the membrane at the door. I'll go into detail of how I cut the membrane and waterproof the corners in a later video when I fit the windows and doors. At this point, I really didn't like seeing the membrane layers flapping about and was concerned this might lead to damage, so I applied lapping tape over the seam. In hindsight, I probably would have ditched the double-sided tape and just used the lapping tape. I also needed to cut away the bottom plate from across the doorway. For context, the building was left without a roof but with a tarp for just one day, and look how much water is collected. I am very pleased now that I decided to add that damp-proof membrane over the floor, but with better weather forecasts and the next job being the roof, it's now time to cut away the membrane. In the next video, as I already mentioned, I'll be looking at cold roof and warm roof designs. I spent a huge amount of time researching this, contacting roofing companies, garden room specialists and membrane manufacturers to understand the logic and best practices. But in doing this research, I came across a rather obvious flaw that seems hypocritical to ignore and undermines the entire membrane system. I'll discuss this and then reveal what approach we'll be using and how we'll be overcoming this problem. In the video after that, I'm going to build the roof and get the building watertight before it rains. Until then, cheerio!